each year than for Tasmania, more like autumn, winter and spring, particularly when the highland ice or the alpine snow flows down through the streams. So I just love being close to water and just exploring. And the adventures, I guess. I've been on some pretty incredible adventures. I've met some amazing people through photography, and some incredible, dangerous, crazy, stupid, but always awesome things, and just some memories that I can't forget. You know, things like walking the Overland Track multiple times now, through to getting bogged with a van of workshop students in a place where, you know, just some crazy. I'll cover that a bit later. But just, yeah, some really cool adventures. So I guess waterfalls for me, I just love the feeling of it. For many years when I was running a marketing agency, I would work ridiculously crazy hours, and I'd break my days up with trips through the walks around the local area where I lived in Hobart. So I lived within, pretty close to Wellington National Park. So I had all of the base of Mount Wellington to explore, literally within walking distance. So it was a thing that I regularly did. So, all right. So any questions about any of that to begin with? No, I'm going to guess not. And I guess another reason too that I really like waterfalls is the post-processing techniques. For me, I'm colorblind as well. So getting back into the simplicity of the colors of the greens and the mixes of green and yellow, I find it quite easy to do, but throw in some magenta and blues and oranges and all sorts of other colors with sunsets, and quite often I get the colors wrong. So waterfalls just kind of work really well for me. All right, so I've got a few tips and tricks here that we'll start with. Just a few key pointers of things that I've especially learned myself and from teaching as well. One of the first things is that stability is key. A lot of the shots that I take are long exposures, and you can't take long exposures with a camera that's unstable. Sorry, guys. So having a really stable tripod is really important. I think a stable tripod outside of the camera and lens itself is one of the best investments that you'll be able to make to capture the style of images that I shoot here. So remote shutter triggering is really, really important. So when shooting waterfalls, stability, and to be able to trigger the camera remotely, so you're not introducing vibrations through the camera. There's also other reasons for it as well. I guess some of the places that I get my camera gear into, it's just easier to not necessarily be chest deep in water while my camera is on like literally floating above the surface of the water and trying to trigger it with my hand. There's another story for afterwards in one of the waterfalls that I cover. Using a circular polarizer it's really important. I don't shoot any waterfall images without a circular polarizer. It will always be on my lens. And using it right, though, it's not just about having it on your lens, it's also about knowing how to use it as well. And I'll cover some tips with the circular polarizer after as well. So use ND filters. So ND filters are all about slowing your shutter or balancing light. Quite often, one of the things that I see is people trying to shoot waterfalls with a 10-stop ND in a situation where you're pushing exposure times out 3 and 4 minutes. There's no need for it. So choosing the correct ND filters is really important. Most shutter speeds that I'll shoot at with a waterfall are anywhere from 0.25 of a second through to maybe 15 seconds. And 15 seconds will be the absolute maximum. But 0.25 to 5 seconds is kind of the area that I'm aiming for. Shooting when there's even light. Now, it's very hard to get a perfectly balanced image when you're shooting when there's light penetrating through into a forest and there's shadows everywhere else around the forest. So you either want everything to be completely lit up or you want everything to be completely overcast. So overcast skies and cloudy skies are the best, and that's the best weather to go chasing waterfalls. Standing in the rain, shooting a waterfall, that's when you want to be doing it, when the water's just at its peak, just coming down, starting to flow down. A couple of days after, a lot of the waterfalls that I shoot in have already dried up. So getting out there when the skies are overcast and cloudy, firstly, it's going to give you the best light, but it's also going to give you the best conditions to shoot in. You just got to think about your camera gear and some other things about safety, but Again, we can touch on that later. So looking for strong compositions, I'm always looking for a composition with a really strong leading line, framing of an image, a really strong foreground, even center balanced images, depending on if I'm shooting a grander scene or a smaller tight waterfall. If I'm shooting a really wide scene, I'm trying to get right up close to something to create a foreground. If I'm shooting with a telephoto lens, for example, trying to isolate part of the waterfall, it's not so important. Then framing comes into it, where rules of third or center balanced images are really important. Knowing your locations and seasons, this is a good one as well. It's so Northern Territory, for example, you want to be up there when the waterfalls are at their peak, but it's also very hard to be up there when the waterfalls are at the peak, because if you've ever been up there in wet season, the roads are closed. So getting access into these sort of places. In Tasmania, for example, shooting waterfalls in peak winter quite often can lead to really messy, heavy water flow, water spray on your lenses. So coming through more into spring in Tasmania is the perfect time to shoot, when the water's still flowing, but it's not flowing down after the really heavy, crazy rainfall. Be prepared to get wet. I always say that you're not doing the job properly if you don't get wet. So if you're with waterfall photography, whether you're up in your ankles or up to your chest deep in water, or you're getting sprayed and covered, or you're trying to stand behind a waterfall, or you're wading through something you just got to be prepared to get wet to get the best shots. Quite often that's the best compositions as well. And something else is really important, I guess, is one that I've learned quite a lot: carry lens cloths, and a lot of them. If you're standing in front of a heavy flowing waterfall, it's really important to be able to dry the front of your lens. Otherwise, you can end up with shots that just aren't exposed properly. You've got water drops on them that end up being foggy and misty, things that you can't clean up within post-processing, I guess. So, all right, any questions on any of that? Or just stop there for a second. Yes. Any questions there?
Waterproofing your gear while you're shooting.
Yeah, it's a tough one, because I guess you can get lens covers and camera covers and those sort of things, but quite often they actually introduce more humidity to the camera than you probably would get without it in, because the cameras, the lens covers and the camera covers themselves become foggy inside, and that's not good for your gear either. So it's kind of hard. Like you carry an umbrella or do whatever you're doing, but you just got to kind of be prepared for your gear to get wet, I think, with shooting waterfalls.
Jason, there was a couple of questions about if you can maybe mention where the falls are of the photos that you're shooting on each slide as well.
Perfect. Yeah, cool. No problem. So I'll just go back for a few of these here. So I will talk about some of these images a little bit more in depth. So this is Lower Chasm Falls in Tasmania. So this is one of my favorite waterfalls. This is Mid or Upper Chasm Falls in Tasmania. Quite hard to get into, and a track that for me was almost impossible to find originally to get in here. This particular shot, I'm actually standing and the water is up to my chest. I got right in as far as I possibly could safely, having a 1.80 meter plus center column tripod, and the camera was just sitting just level on top of the water here. So that was this is Mid Chasm Falls. So that's actually upstream from this waterfall here. The next waterfall, so this is Hopeton Falls on the Gradation Road. Now I've visited this waterfall 13 or 14 times, I think, at last count. It's one of my favorite waterfalls in Australia. I just love the clean drop of the water that comes over the rocks. If you get there at the right time of the year and you don't get the spray that comes off the waterfall here, and you just get beautiful flow coming through. There's so many compositions to shoot. I've hosted workshops here many times. We've done multiple day workshops, even just running out of Melbourne through to the Gradation Road to get here. But the overnight ones are much better, but it's just one of my all-time favorite waterfalls here in Australia in particular. And this is Russell Falls, so this is in Tasmania. I guess this is probably the waterfall that realistically gave me plenty of practice with shooting waterfalls. It was an hour drive from my house. Just about every person that ever came to visit me in Tasmania, every visiting photographer in Tasmania, just about everybody with a camera, I would take them here. And it's just an incredible location and really, really easily accessible. Cool. Any more questions on those at all?
That's it so far, Jason, on questions. So unless anyone's got any they want to ask live, just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Jason, have you ever fallen into a waterfall?
Good evening, Earl. Yes, I have, and I've witnessed you falling into a waterfall myself as well. So, yeah, thanks for joining us. Welcome. Yes, I have fallen into a waterfall several times, so, and I've deliberately gone into waterfalls as deeply as I could several times as well. Yeah. All right. So we'll move along. One of the first and key things that's really important, having a stable tripod, and not all tripods are created equally. Tripods are one of the most overlooked pieces of equipment that I have ever seen, like with any workshop student that I've seen. It's just something that people don't consider is super important, but having a rigid, sturdy, easy to use, easy to maintain tripod that doesn't vibrate at the tiniest bit of wind or tiniest bit of movement, particularly when you're shooting waterfalls, is really important. The thickness of the tubes, the thickness of the legs, whether they're waterproof, these are all things to consider. So long exposures really do require stability. So if you can't handheld shoot something for 15 seconds, you can try, you're probably not going to end up with the best result. To be able to capture sharp images, it's just simple. To maintain detail, you need your lens, your camera to be stable. Waterproof models are the best. I think if you're going to stick a tripod into water, you don't want to be carrying tubes of water home with you. So just the same with sand, anything else. Having a waterproof tripod is just going to help you easily maintain it as well. The leg locks tend to prevent anything going inside the leg. And it's just a really beneficial part of a tripod, I believe, or how do you say, a feature of a tripod. If you can get a tripod to stand at least eye height. So I'm 1.83 meters. So for me, I'm looking for a tripod that's going to be about 1.80 meters without a center column. Okay, and there are some models. I'll cover those on the next slide. But you've also got to ensure that it can support the gear that you're putting on it as well. If you ever intend to put massive telephoto lenses onto a tripod, then you're going to need something that's going to be able to support that weight. But the other thing here too is, so a DSLR or a mirrorless camera paired with, say, a 16-35 or 24-70 lens, they're going to weigh anywhere from 3 to 4 kilos. It's not just about the weight, the weight that's on top. It's also about the stability as well. So you want the legs themselves to not flex. You want the legs to not have any kind of give in them when there's potential of water motion to kind of flow onto a tripod. So I have used many tripods on the market over the years. I've used Manfrotto's, Gitzo's, previously used Surui, Gitzo again, and over the last few years, entirely using Surui tripods. And the ones that I recommend, and the reasons are for this are the Surui W2204 30 ball head. Now that's in my picture here. It is the tallest tripod that you can see. Now it's a waterproof tripod model. And again, for me, I'm 1.83 meters. It stands 1.80 meters without the center column. So I don't need the center column at all to kind of reach up to my eye height. And I find that's really important, particularly when I'm trying to get into places where I may not have full reach or functionality of the tripod, where I'm trying to place it or whatever. Like the bottom of a stream could be deeper in sections than it is in others. It could be rocky. So I'm looking for a tripod that I can easily use and can control at high height. Really easy to clean and maintain, tall, carbon fiber. Now, carbon fiber for me, it's going to be more rigid and stable. Aluminium flexes more than carbon fiber. So when you got water rushing or wind rushing, and it's quite often both as well, because a heavy waterfall can actually create its own wind pattern. So you get wind and water flowing down past you. It's really important to have the legs just not flexing. And carbon fiber is going to be a much better option than aluminium. It's also going to be far lighter. Sorry. In the W2204 tripod in particular, it's very lightweight for its size. So we're looking at less than 2 kilograms with the head that you can see on it. In the picture, it's the tallest tripod in my picture there. Now, the second tallest tripod on the left-hand side of it is, you can see the head on that. I quite often use that head as well. So you can see the 2 tallest tripods, those 2 heads I quite often combine either way. And it just kind of depends on how much stability I'm looking for and how quickly I want to be able to move things around. They are slightly different components, one's from Sunway Photo, one's from Surui. And it supports up to 18 kilos of gear. It's also supporting it quite stably as well. So the legs aren't flexing or bending. Another type of tripod though that's quite good for waterfall photography, and really this is based on its weight. When you're hiking and trying to get into places, a 6-day hike, for example, on the Overland Track in Tasmania, the first time I ever did it, I carried my heaviest tripod. The second time I did it, I took one of these lighter tripods, and I was thanking myself for it. It's just a lot smaller, a lot more compact, not as tall, so it doesn't have a center column to be able to get up to my eye height. But when I needed to carry everything I needed for 6 days on my back, it was far better in terms of weight, and to be able to strap to a bag. Can still support 15 kilos, not waterproof, but it only weighed 1.6 kilos as well. And it's really important. Like when you're shooting, as I keep saying, stability is really important when you're shooting. So having a good tripod is quite a beneficial thing. And I've been at workshops where you get the ones where they've got like a wind-up column that go up in the middle, and you can just see the wind just flexes the tripod, even around Sydney Harbour. So it's super important, and for anywhere from say a $500 to $700 investment, these should last you years as well. And it's going to be able to support multiple camera models.
Jason, just a question about tripods and heads. What about a geared head, I guess, versus a ball head? Why would you recommend one over the other?
I prefer a ball head just simply for speed and flexibility. So geared head takes too long for me to get into position. I think they're really fine when you've got to make super fine refinements and worry about distortion, things like architectural photography. But for me, just a ball head is far more flexible and quicker to position exactly where I want it. I don't want to be, I'm trying to move around and maximize the amount of shots that I can get at any visit or any trip that I'm making. And I just find I would just much prefer to unwind and move a ball head rather than a geared head.
And I guess weight's probably an issue as well. If you're walking into these waterfalls, geared heads tend to be a bit heavier as well.
Definitely. I find they're just more complicated to use. And look, I know a lot of people will use them and swear by them, and everybody each to their own with this. But for me, it's just a lot of things that can go wrong with the movement on them. And just in my experience, the ball head's a top selling product, within the Surui product range. And for me, just flexibility. And they're super strong as well. So like a geared head, you're going to be looking at 4 to 5 kilos or something for an average gear head to be able to hold and support. Whereas with a ball head, the actual tensile mechanism with the ball it's so much stronger. Cool. Any other questions?
If you've got any other questions about tripods, feel free to unmute yourself and ask one.
What's the model of the Sunway Photo ball head you've got on the smaller tripod?
That's
on the left.
Yes, that's the XB52. So out of all of the ball heads that I've ever used, that is my favorite ball head by far. It's just slightly heavier though than the Surui ball heads. The Surui ball heads The XB52 will hold up to 50 kilos or support up to 50 kilos, and they're commonly used and sold at the moment for heavy caliber or large caliber assault rifles at gun ranges and those sort of things. So they are quite heavy, but they're extremely sturdy. Like you get once you get the lock nut done up or the ball done up, they don't move at all. You could support your body weight basically on one side of it. They're so strong.
Thank you.
No problems. All right, now.
Jason, just another question. Would you carry a Siri AM284 on the Overland Track or a lighter option than that?
I would take either the AM284 or the AM254. Any of those are fine. The 284 I've taken in, and I've taken that into some really, really heavy flow during winter. One of the Overland Track trips that I did, there was a crazy amount of water coming through some of the streams there, and the 284 was beautiful, perfect in terms of stability. There's a 254 as well, which is a slight step down and slightly lighter.
Cool. And another question: would you? Someone would prefer a smaller waterproof tripod. Could you recommend one?
Well, there's the W1004 as well, I guess, in the Surui range. It is smaller in terms of its legs, the leg diameter, so probably not as rigid or maybe a little bit more susceptible to flexing, I think. This is just
ST124 as well.
The ST124 and the A10X ball head, isn't it? I think I haven't used that tripod, so that's one of our newest on the market in terms of waterproof tripods. So I haven't actually used that one. We've been locked down pretty much since we've had that tripod in existence in the warehouse. So one day I'll be able to get out and test that. But yeah, we do have the ST124 as well. Yeah. All right.
Cool, I think that's it.
Now this is the result of not doing all of those things that I have just said correctly. Having a sturdy, stable tripod, really not paying attention to my gear when it wasn't stable and mounted correctly. So this is a 5DSR, and I also lost the 16 to 35 in a waterfall in Tasmania where my tripod wasn't stable enough. The water hit it. I didn't have my eyes on it, and it just toppled straight over. So nearly $8,000 worth of gear gone straight away. So it was a pretty expensive learning experience in camera stability. I think I've got a PhD now in terms of how to set a tripod up correctly. I definitely learnt my lesson with this one. It was quite an upsetting little time. It was a beautiful waterfall, but unfortunately I didn't get any good shots because I wasn't able to take any. I didn't even get a shot off before this happened. So that was pretty depressing day for me. But yeah, so don't do this. Just make sure you set your tripod up. That's it. Just make sure you're looking after it and putting your gear on a stable platform, because I don't want anybody else to have this happen to them.
Rice didn't work, Jason?
No, Rice didn't work, nothing. This was Canon. They sent it back to me. So I sent it to Canon. They kind of kindly said, yeah, we'll look after you, of course. And the camera got there and they said, there's nothing we can do to look after you. The whole camera was stuffed. So I tried Rice, I tried everything. I tried the air conditioning, like hot air, but everything I could possibly think of. But yeah, it was pretty screwed. So it was about a $5,500 bill to replace the camera pretty much for that. So now, so beyond tripods, something that I find very useful is making sure that you can remotely trigger your camera. So while it's important to be making sure your camera gear is stable and secure and all of those sort of things, having a remote shutter is going to allow you to actually step back from your tripod when it is safe to do it. It's going to allow you to remotely trigger you and shoot shots. It's going to allow you to get in front of the camera if you happen to want to take selfies and wear a red jacket in the forest. So there's a remote trigger can be had in quite a few different ways, either via a cable with a mechanism like a Harnell remote. Some cameras have got mobile apps that allow you to connect to them via Bluetooth to remotely trigger them. So Canon, for example, have the Camera Connect app. So some cameras from the 5D Mark IV, EOS R, and some of the APS-C models as well have got wireless triggering on them. So you can download raw files and those things, but just control everything from your settings and everything from the app on your phone. A phone is an expensive thing to be worrying about, though, again, when you're out there shooting waterfalls. So some of the conditions that I've gotten into, the last thing I want to be doing is carrying another $2,000 object in my pocket, just in case I fall. So try to find a simpler way. The Nissi Bluetooth remote, that's actually a brand new product on the market as well. I just found it's a tiny little device that, in the right conditions, use with a mobile phone really, really easily. So allows you to control calculate ND exposure times using ND filters for long exposures. So yeah, really cool little product. But any kind of remote trigger, it's really important. I tend to prefer something that's not on a cable if I can. So even if it's a Harnell remote, I want to be able to wirelessly trigger it rather than be standing within 1.5 meters of the camera. It just allows you more flexibility of getting different types of shots. And again, it's also about vibration-free shooting. You don't want to be triggering your camera. Obviously, you can set a timer on your camera if you want to and trigger it, but you don't want to be triggering your cameras if you can help it. If you can remotely do it and introduce zero vibration into your camera, it's going to be quite helpful. So some will allow you to shoot continuous shooting, time-lapse modes, all sorts of different things. So a wireless remote trigger is a really good investment to make. All right, any questions about wireless triggers? Or... All right, okay, we'll move along. Now, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions about circular polarizers, or there'll be a few come through, so feel free to drop them in, ask. We've got quite a few different Nissi polarizers as well within our product range. And I'm just going to give an overview of why I use them with waterfall photography in particular. So first reason is you can slow your shutter speed with it. So you're looking at about a 1 to 1.5 stop ND filter, without the polarizing factor. And in some cases, that's enough. That can push your exposure times out to 0.5 second to 1 second, depending on how much ambient or light there is penetrating through the floor or penetrating through the roof of the canopy of a waterfall, or some of the darker forests around. Like you don't need an ND filter other than a polarizer. So 1 to 1.5 stops can be quite enough. They're designed to increase saturation and vibrancy in your images, particularly within the foliage of the, around the forest areas. With all sorts of shots, though, obviously it can introduce better saturation into the sky as well. I try not to shoot too many skies in my waterfall shots, as you'll probably notice. There's not too many. They're all, I try to crop or get compositions without the sky. I just find that balance of light to be better for me personally with a lot of the compositions I work with. But also another thing, it reduces the reflections and glare from wet surfaces. So when everything's soaked by rain or soaked by flowing water or these incredible lush forests around, there's always going to be water there. So surfaces of leaves, of rocks, of even the top of the water itself, where you can be able to see into the water if you've got your polarizer orientated correctly. Now, the circular polarizer is designed to be spun in a circle, and by spinning it in a circle, you're actually creating a variance in the way or the angles of the light that enter the lens. Okay, so if you have your polarizer wrong, we can have images like this. Now, these are just straight out of the camera, no edits on them, nothing. So basically what we're looking at here is an image that's shot without the CPL. Now, what you can see here, and you'll be able to notice this more when I show you the next image, really is have a look around the logs themselves. You can see a lot of light reflection. Now, those logs are all wet. So any light that's coming off the logs is going to kind of just show as glare or show a reflection on them. You can also see a bit of a lack of vibrancy in the foliage as well. And you'll see it again when I actually flick over to the next image. Now, I'll just flick back quickly. So you can see the logs in the front, in the foreground in particular, when I flick through here, you can actually see we've taken all of the reflection and the shine, everything that's causing that, the highlights, I guess, in an image. So those logs there without, there's going to be a lot of highlights. You'll see that your histograms when you're shooting are actually pushed very far to the right of the camera as compared to this, where you find when you're looking at a histogram on an image, it's going to be more centered and better spread, slightly to the left of the image as well. But far more greens, far more, I guess, yellowy green at this particular time as well within this image. So you can see the back wall as well up near the waterfall itself. You can see the shine without the CPL. And then when you have it on, you can actually see far less shine and off the wet surfaces. So a CPL, I always shoot with them. I don't even know, I honestly don't, I found it hard to find a before and after with and without a polarizer, because I have always shot with polarizers on when I'm shooting waterfalls. It was one of the very first things that I noticed, I guess, when I started to post-process. It was just so much easier to get the colors exactly the way I wanted them when I was using the polarizer correctly. So getting them right in the camera is going to be far better. So any questions about polarizers at all? Nothing? No questions about polarizers?
Jason, I've got a couple of questions.
Yep, cool.
So typically, you mentioned you're shooting a wide angle lens, like a 16 to 35.
Yep.
And normally people would say don't use polarizers on a wide angle lens. Is it okay in this situation to use it?
I always, no matter what. So if I'm shooting a 16 mil, so I quite often shoot with either a 16 to 35 or a 15 to 35, depending on if I'm EF or RF lenses with Canon. Always shoot with a polarizer on, even at 16 mil. I tend to find it's maybe a little bit different in a bigger scene where you've got much more sky, but the field of view is still going to be small enough that you're going to get an evenly balanced polarization across it, unless you've got the sun to either side. So a polarizer is best used when the sun is 90 degrees above you or behind you or in front of you. So the way that they work is trying to get that. So it still depends on where the position of the sun is, but a 16 to 35 mil lens for me, I will always use a polarizer still.
Another question in chat is, do you use live view when you shoot?
Yes, I always use live view. Unless I'm shooting with a app enabled, like Camera Connect on a Canon camera, for example, where I can see a live view on my phone, I will always use live view. I just tend to find, even for me now, I'm getting older to begin with, so my eyesight's not so good, and so it's a little bit easier to have the bigger picture. But I don't like looking through my camera so much when it's on a tripod. I tend to frame everything with live view if I can. I can't think of too many occasions where I won't. I find as well, like with live view, you can tilt your camera screen out or tilt the screen to different angles and all that. So just more flexible to shoot, I guess, using the screen rather than looking through a viewfinder as such.
Yeah.
Can I ask, if you're using live view and you're using a circular polarizer, do you use manual or autofocus?
Depends, I guess. So I quite often use manual focus if I'm getting really close to something with a strong foreground element. I guess I just zoom in when it comes to needing to manual focus. So I actually zoom in. You can quite often go from 1 to 5 to 10 to 15 times, I think, with most cameras, of zooming in to try and get those focus details correct. Most cameras these days, though, their autofocus is crazy. So you can pretty much trust it. You can do all sorts of things with focus stacking as well if you're really worried about, trying to get that focus 100% correct. But for me, majority of the time, it's going to be manual focus if I'm close to something. But if it's a wide scene like this image that's on the screen at the moment, I just use autofocus and focus 1/3 of the way into the image, really, for the hyperfocal distance.
And Jason, another question from chat. How do you find the best point when rotating the CPL?
So I actually look on the back of so I use a live histogram, and I use the histogram and have that displayed on the screen. And when I'm rotating the polarizer, I'm trying to get the best spread of detail from shadows to highlights with nothing peaking in the highlights. So a CPL, when it's incorrectly orientated, unless you're deliberately trying to introduce that effect, but if it's incorrectly orientated for removing shadows, you'll see a peak towards the highlights. And as you rotate the polarizer, you'll see the histogram will actually move left towards the shadows more and kind of spread out more. So I'm looking at the live histogram quite often to really judge and view where it is. But I guess it's also at the point of maximum saturation for a lot of people as well. Like if you're looking through a live view or through your viewfinder, just looking for that point where the colors themselves become the most vibrant, that's probably most likely to also be the point where the reflections and glare is removed from your image as well.
Cool. Another question in chat is, what is the difference between a circular CPL and a square one? And someone else wants to know, which CPL do you specifically use?
So square polarizers are square, really. That's probably the easiest way to, as compared to a circular polarizer. Look, I don't use square polarizers at all. We've got the HT polarizer within our range within Nissi, but I generally tend to use the enhanced CPL. That's the CPL that comes with most of the current V6 kits. We've got three major CPLs in our product range at the moment. One is your standard HUC CPL or Pro CPL. One is the enhanced CPL, and one is the natural CPL. The standard Pro CPL tends to create a slightly warmer image with less saturation. The enhanced CPL creates a slightly cooler image with more saturation. And the natural CPL is right in the middle, where it doesn't shift your color or white balance at all in any direction, and creates, I guess, the closest to the true replication of what you're seeing right in front of you without any saturation introduced. So we've got quite a few different ones. It can be quite confusing for us on a daily basis as well, and even just using them to know which one. But I use the enhanced CPL the majority of the time.
Cool. And shooting a waterfall, if you needed to add an ND filter, what strength would you typically use?
Well, I'm about to go on to ND filters next. So the strength that doesn't push the shutter speed out for too long really is probably the easiest way to quickly explain that. But I will touch on that a little bit more over the next few slides.
Yeah. Another quick question about this slide in particular. On this image, are you dialing in the CPL on the greens or the log?
I'm dialing in the CPL on the log. So I'm actually looking for as least reflection as possible off those logs. But that's actually a point where you'll tend to find that you'll maximize your saturation and vibrancy in those greens anyway. When you have the polarizer rotated the opposite way, I'll just go back, you tend to find a washed out color with the green. It just lacks that vibrancy and saturation as compared to this one. And you can see it straight away. It's just, I've set it for the log to remove the reflection off the log in the foreground, but that's actually just the right position to get it into for the saturation. Cool. All right. Any other questions about CPLs before we move on?
Just a comment someone's made, the CPLs also help keep the front of the lens clean when you're around waterfalls as well.
It does, but then that just gets dirty. So yeah, that's a good way to just make sure you've got plenty of lens cloths in your pocket, and don't fall into a waterfall or fall into something and get water in your pocket and then use your lens cloth that's wet. So that's happened many times as well. But yeah, just make sure you got lens cloths. But yes, it can protect the front of your lens, but you've still got a glass element in a circular polarizer that's going to end up with that water mist and spray on it anyway. Most modern lenses aren't going to suffer too badly from having a few water spots on them as long as you don't submerge them. All right, cool. We'll move on from CPRs. All right, so So neutral density filters. So neutral density filters, and when this is completely separate from polarizers. So ND filters really are designed to slow your shutter speed down. They're designed to reduce the amount of light that enters your lens and hits your camera sensor. That's the very basics of them. So very common ND filters within many photography's kits are an ND8 or a 3-stop, ND64, which is a 6-stop, ND1000, which is a 10-stop, ND3200, which is a 15-stop. For me, when I'm using or shooting waterfalls, I tend to not use anything beyond an ND64 under most normal circumstances. And an ND64 even is pushing it out way too long. So so 6-stop ND, shooting at a 1-second base exposure, you're going to be shooting 64 seconds to accurately expose your image. So, and in some of the conditions that I'm shooting in, a 1-second base exposure time is not unusual. So anything from the polarizer only to a 3-stop would typically be what I'd be shooting with. And then beyond that, a 6-stop at the most, unless it's really bright and sunny. There's obviously going to be, conditions that we can certainly use a 10-stop at some stage, but it's not a filter that I'm reaching for when I'm shooting waterfalls. This particular waterfall that you can see here is Chasm Falls, Lower Chasm Falls in Tasmania. Again, this was in some pretty heavy winter flow that was coming down here, and you can see with this particular image, you've still got the texture detail in the water. And sometimes when you're shooting waterfalls, one of the first things to do is just to make silky smooth water rather than still maintaining that texture detail. And I tend to find I like to shoot both images. So this is actually an image shot without an ND filter. But for ND filters, when I am shooting, I'm going to be using a 3 or a 6-stop at the most. A polarizer generally does the job. And another, it's not just the water, it's also the moving objects and everything else around the waterfall. So quite often the waterfalls themselves will actually produce their own little energy and weather pattern within its basin, and the foliage and everything just moves, and you can be standing there and just watching things moving. And if you're using an ND filter that pushes out your exposure time for too long, you're just going to end up with blurry foliage, and that can actually be quite distracting for your images. So we'll just have a quick look at a couple of different images here side by side. So this was a waterfall shot on my way to Frenchman's Cap in southwest Tasmania, and this I was literally just about to walk up one of the most intense part of the walk to get up to the top of Frenchman's, and this is a stream that was at the bottom, and I just had to stop and capture it. It was pretty cool. But the image on the left is a faster shutter speed. Okay, so this was shot using a polarizer only. Okay, on the lens, and it was shot at a 0.25 second. And you can still see the texture detail within the water, as compared to the image on the right. When we're shooting, I was shooting with a 6-second image here, so I've actually put a 6-stop onto the a 3-stop onto the lens to shoot this one, and you can see I guess very similar, but more dreamy and silkier smooth. And so I think when you're shooting with ND filters, as compared to not shooting with an ND filter, it can create a whole different dynamic to the image. Seeing the texture detail can actually create, I guess, a bigger sense of drama, whereas going with super long exposures can create more of a sense of time passing in an image. And again, it doesn't matter. Everybody's going to like their own. I like both styles of images. And I think I used to shoot a lot like on the right, where we're really looking for that perfect, silky, smooth water with no texture detail. And then I really started to kind of step back and just make sure that I'm capturing multiple images when I am shooting, so that I'm not just shooting with one shutter speed. I'm trying to get that. So when you're using to do that, really needs to be using ND filters to do it, to push those exposure times out longer. So I tend to do them both, but I just won't take anything above normally a 6-stop ND. And we're talking a 6-stop ND plus a polarizer as well. So that's going to be 7.5 stops of light difference when you're shooting with a with a polarizer on as compared to just with an ND filter. So that's something else to consider as well. Once you start using grad filters and stacking, like your ND filters are starting to add up in situations that can be quite dark to begin with and quite limited light. An ND filter as well isn't just a 6-stop or 10-stop or whatever. It's also graduated ND filters as well. And so the filters that I really do recommend shooting with and recommend having within your kit to begin with any form of CPL. I shoot with the enhanced CPL, and this is mostly primarily because I shoot with a square filter system. The V6 filter system in Nissi really is probably the most flexible way to ensure that you can still stack filters. The difference between square filters and circular filters for me is the ability to stack them and to limit the amount of vignetting that's going to occur in your images afterwards. Circular filters, though, are great when you only want to use one filter. So if you only want to use a polarizer, that's great. But if you want to potentially use graduated NDs plus a polarizer, it's very hard to use circular filters. They're much lighter to travel with, quite convenient to screw onto the front of your lens, but just more limiting in I guess, the ability to use them. So the enhanced CPL and Nissi ND, also an ND8, so a 3-stop ND, you can see through that filter. So if you hold a 3-stop ND up, you can see through it. So that they don't reduce the light so much. It's literally 3 stops. So a 3-second image is going to become, 6 seconds? 1, 2, 4, 8. No, 4 seconds. 8 seconds. So a 1 second exposure is going to become 8 seconds. And you see a ND64, if you're shooting 1 second base exposure, it's going to become 64 seconds. Now, I always use graduated ND filters when you've got light filtering higher through a waterfall. Okay, so a 3-stop soft graduated ND and a 3-stop medium graduated ND. I can't spell. There you go. It's a medium. We should reinvent or rename our filters, Andrew, just for this. But, so that is a medium graduated ND. So they're the 2 ND filters that I use, and I do use them for slightly different reasons. Medium grad when it's much brighter in the sky. A soft graduated ND when it could be, say, foggy or filtered light coming through the top of a forest. And again, I use a 100mm filter holder as well to stack my filters. Cool.
Jason, just back to the first image you shared in the ND section. Are you able to tell us where you focused when taking that image?
Yep, I've actually focused directly on the front where you can see the shape of the splash here. Can you see my mouse, I guess, circling through there? So I've actually focused directly here. I believe, if I remember rightly, I was looking at this today, it's f11 that I've used. So in terms of aperture, it still creates plenty of depth of field all the way through. So I've got right up close to this waterfall. And again, if probably a few people have visited this waterfall by now, this is standing in this particular spot here with the flow here is pretty hard when it flows through here. It's pretty deep and very sketchy. So I wanted to really kind
of. How wet did you get taking this shot?
I got extremely wet. Yeah. This same day, I'll tell the story a little bit further down at the end of this. My favorite images and story, which we'll combine this image with that. But I got very wet and quite cold too, because that's actually ice water that's flowing down out of the Central Highlands down through into the northwest of Tassie in the Meander State Forest. So it's ice water in the middle of winter.
And do you use waders or water shoes?
No, I don't. But a mate of mine who I used to shoot with started to, because we were stupid and we're trying to get into places and just do stuff like this of what you can see on the screen, I guess. And he used to love them. He swore by them. He kept himself dry. I was always soaking wet and complaining about being wet. So yeah, I mean, they worked for him, but I personally don't. Gum boots and things as well for me. Like it's just too much gear to carry to some of the places that I go, unless I can get in there from, walk off a car track and not travel too far. I probably won't take gum boots. I tend to find I just get my gum boots full of water anyway. So I just don't know my limits. I just go past it. If my gum boots are up to my knees, I'll get in up to my hips in water. So I just try to limit the amount of gear that I have and try to be practical still.
Cool.
Now, this waterfall as well, just to touch on, this is Beauchamp Falls in the Gradation Road. So this is one of the, I guess, the regular waterfalls that I visit kind of during workshops and the countless trips that I did along the Gradation Road. Quite steep to walk out of. It's good walking in. It's not too bad walking in, but walking out of there quite wet and cold. By the time you come out of this waterfall, can be quite tough. It just never seems to end coming out. It's an easy track, but it's uphill a lot. I know of some of our workshops where workshop students have decided to stay in the car rather than come in to us, and then regretted it when we all got amazing shots and they didn't. So. All right. And anything else with ND filters before I move on?
Not in chat, but if anyone's got a question, feel free to ask it.
All right. So let's have a chat about some composition tips. I think waterfalls just provide so many opportunities for different compositions. And my aim when I'm looking at shooting pretty much anything, but especially waterfalls, is to create visual depth in my image. So I tend to look at an image not just in rule of thirds in flat, as in just a two-dimensional, but also rule of thirds in terms of depth as well. Trying to place objects that seemingly appear in thirds into the depth of the scene. So I'm looking at a two-dimensional plus a three-dimensional rule of thirds when I'm shooting. And I'm trying to guide the viewer's eyes through a scene. Now, this particular waterfall, again, is Hopeton Falls. I captured this on my first trip in there, actually. I couldn't believe it because I guess prior to going in there, I'd actually chatted with the person that I went in there with and said, how cool would it be if we got the beams of light coming through? And he's like, it might happen today. It's pretty overcast and ever. And we got in there. And as soon as we got in there, just these beams of light came through the top and just pierced through the clouds and came through. So I was pretty happy with this one, but it really is a centered composition on this. The log that you can see protruding in from the left-hand side's always annoyed me. I've tried to clone it out and make it look good, but I always just go back to it being there because that was the scene at the time. This waterfall looks quite a lot different now. It's got far more logs and debris in there from falling storms, but we used, I guess, the big rock on the right-hand side of the image as a strong foreground element. I actually liked how it angled in diagonally towards the waterfall as well. Everything seems to point in towards the waterfall. But yeah, trying to create the depth there and just using a center balanced composition on this. So a strong foreground element is really important. This is Mariners Falls. Definitely went in there before we weren't allowed to go in there. But this is I just used this log in the front to kind of create the depth. And I guess the sun star up in the sky to just add a little bit of extra something to the scene. But yeah, I think the log itself is just a great example of what I'm trying to do with the foreground element of placing it 1/3 of the way, or seemingly 1/3 of the way into the scene to create that depth of perspective. Now, these images don't look too much different, but I think in terms of composition, this is a good way to represent how quite literally stepping 2 steps to the side can change the entire composition as well. So this is Helensberg Tunnel in Sydney, or just south of Sydney. I was lucky enough to be there during a workshop, and it was pouring down with rain. So we were pretty happy to have the waterfall flowing on that day, but even just the tiniest little step to the side of 2 meters to the side there just changed the whole perspective of the leading lines that run through with the train track. And this is, I guess, an example for me of just trying to shoot as many images as you can when you get somewhere, not just see an image that somebody else has shot and say you're going to copy it. Just move around a little bit. And quite often I've visited and I've shot just about every angle I can think of this tunnel, just to try and create something different each time. Again, not the best example of, major changes, but what just a tiny little step can do in terms of just zooming out with your feet or moving with your feet to subtly or to make subtle differences to your images. Again, Hopeton Falls in Gradation Road, and I think this is a good example of using a leading line, using the stream itself to actually guide your eye through the image. Now, I think you can either look at the water flowing down the waterfall and look at that and trail diagonally through to the bottom right of the scene, or you can read it the other way. It's just really easy to read with your eyes, just to follow those lines and trying to look for that line. I guess most waterfalls that I've shot have kind of got that easy leading line just by following the streams. There's a couple of shots here. So on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, this is Russell Falls again in Tasmania. And this was some of the heaviest flow that I'd seen come through there. It was crazy. Now, I spoke a little bit earlier about foliage and movement in leaves. The one with the frame, the subject, is definitely not the best example of what not to do. You can see all the leaves moving around, but it was impossible to get a shot here. That the water flowing through there is just crazy when it's in its peak. And I guess this is just framing the subject, using something around the subject, the branches, to really kind of create that point of focus, a way to guide your eyes through. Other things that can be used, leaves, frames of trees, rocks, all sorts of different things, but just trying to think of different ways to step back and utilize a foreground element to kind of shape the background as well. This is Belmore Falls on the right-hand side. And again, this is the sense of scale. I think this is about a 200-meter drop, if I'm right. If I don't remember exactly, somebody then might be able to tell me, but it's a huge waterfall. Getting down in there is pretty sketchy as well, particularly on this day that we'd gone in. Some of the track had been washed out. The rocks were extremely slippery as I was standing where I am here, shooting behind the lens. Used the little human in the background there to create a sense of scale. I guess that the sense of scale comes from an object that you know the size of, really. That's just a reference point. This particular one, I turned after taking some of the shots, slipped, twisted my knee, and struggled to get back out the huge climb to get up there, out of here as well. It was a fun adventure, and I know at least one of the people that were on that trip with me is in the chat here at the moment. I'm sure he can remember that trip very well. So yeah, just framing the subject or creating a sense of scale is another way to create interesting compositions with waterfalls. Now, there's I guess an example of creating your composition afterwards as well. So you've captured your image. So this is a widescreen or a 16:9 version crop of Middle Chasm Falls, in Tassie. But I've got two different versions here. One which I would typically use for a background on a computer screen, and one that I would post to Instagram. Compositionally, I think it makes a big difference just trying different crops as well in post-processing. So you can actually frame your images in some way afterwards. Obviously, you're going to get a better result if you can shoot images differently. But if you are limited by, say, water up to your chest or up to your neck almost, as I was here, and I couldn't move around, I could get one composition here safely. A step either side to the left or right, and I would have lost my camera gear. The water's quite deep in here. So yeah, I guess just the opportunity there to create two different images from one starting point, I guess, just by cropping them is a different way as well in terms of thinking of your compositions. So. Cool. Any questions about compositions at all?
Yeah, Jason, there's a couple in chat. The first one is the image with the sunbeams above the waterfall. We're using a graduated filter for that shot.
Yes, I definitely was. Yeah, I was using a 3-stop graduated ND and a polarizer as well. For that, you can see the water itself is see-through down the bottom. You can see it's transparent. So I've actually got the polarizer rotated to see into the water. You can see the vibrancy around the moss for the polarizing factor. But I then had a graduated ND to control the balance of the light at the top as well. Yeah.
Okay, and the shot of Hopeton Falls, what settings, if you remember, would you have used to take that image?
So this is Hopeton Falls here. I think this image was around 6 seconds, if I remember rightly. I shot this quite a while ago, so I'd have to go back through my settings, but I'm pretty sure it's around 6 seconds, even just by looking at the texture detail in the water and the fact that the water in the front is all smooth as well. So that's around 6 seconds. This particular shot here would be about half a second. So that's another one of Hopeton Falls. You can still see some of the texture detail in the back of the waterfall, but also just in the front here, you can still, like, it hasn't smoothed out completely in the foreground elements of the water. So that's about half a second exposure. And that will just be a polarizer and a graduated ND that I've used for that one.
Cool. And a question, what lens are you using in most of these images you've taken?
Yeah, Canon 16-35 or a Canon 15-35, depending on which system, whether I'm shooting mirrorless or EF. But it's a 16-35mm is probably 90% of all of my waterfall shots. Some will be 24-70. Some, I'll show you one which we'll come up to very soon, slightly different as well. But yeah, it's mostly 16-35.
Cool. And a question about Hopeton Falls again. How hard is it to walk into?
It's not hard at all. It's hard. It can be a little bit hard coming out, I guess. Fitness levels are, you don't need too great of a fitness level to get in, but the steps getting down into it that are quite steep. And in the best time to go in there is when it's wet and when it's been raining. So those steps can actually be quite slippery coming out, and quite muddy as well around the area, particularly after it's been some heavy rainfall there. But it's not too hard. Just take your time coming out, really. We've taken many workshop groups in there, and everybody's gotten out safely.
And another question,
here, Jason. In this image here, with the foreground overexposed there, and the background looks pretty good. How can you get more contrast in the foreground there with a filter to get a little bit of detail in the water there?
Yeah, you could flip your graduated ND upside down. You can use 2 graduated NDs.
Oh. Okay.
Or so basically, rather than using the graduated ND for the sky, you can just turn it upside down. So that's a common technique in terms of controlling water, like highlights on water. The other way to do it would be potentially to shoot multiple exposures. I actually quite like it. I don't think, and I'm pretty good with my histogram normally, I don't think it's peaked out in terms of being overexposed. I quite like the contrast of the dark with the quite white, bright water here. But yeah, you could easily control that more with a graduated ND or shoot multiple exposures.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Cool.
And Jason, another question from CK. Have you ever been bitten by anything in the water?
No, but I've come out with leeches a lot. I can't say I've ever been bitten by anything in the water. I try not to go in any water with crocodiles or any of that sort of stuff, but I have had a lot of leeches, and leeches that grow like very, very quickly, and they just fall out of trees quite literally. I mean, Hopeton Falls sometimes has them in some of the muddier sections over to the left of the waterfall here. Some of the Overland Track, it's crazy. Like they quite literally fall out of trees. They're everywhere. So not so much bitten by what's in the water, but I've definitely come out of waterfalls with extra organisms on me that probably shouldn't have been there.
What's your best thing to get rid of the leeches once they lock on?
The vinegar or a lighter of some sort. So typically if we're going camping or into those sort of conditions, we'd be carrying a lighter just to hit them with a flame quickly and makes them drop off and doesn't leave anything stuck in your skin because they retract pretty quickly. So
what I use is a little squirter bottle with a bit of Caro.
Yep, kerosene. Yeah, cool.
They seem to drop off pretty quick after that.
That's
just
it.
Just don't use the lighter at the same time.
Oh, actually,
Well, that'll get rid of the leeches, yeah.
actually, another. This is probably not so much waterfalls. This has happened in a waterfall, but ticks as well. And it wasn't me. It was other people within our group. But yeah, ticks have come out of some of our photography trips as well. Yeah.
I've also heard, Jason, too, that some people, when they get a leech, tick, whatever, using the corner of your credit card
Oh,
to
cool.
get in underneath
Yeah,
it.
cool.
Something, something different, I suppose.
Yeah, cool.
Colin in chat is also saying Vegemite. I guess you can use
Vegemite.
Vegemite for lots of things.
Vegemite, mate, isn't that what you put on your elbows to go to Bondi Beach just to keep the sand spiders away? The hoop snakes, doesn't that keep them away? So yeah, Vegemite's good for everything.
Vegemite might be all right for Aussies, but international people mightn't know what Vegemite is.
Mate, I think a lot of international people would prefer to rub it on the skin than to eat it. So
That's true.
Jason, another question from chat. Are you carrying a backpack or camera bag when you go on these treks into the waterfalls?
Yes, always. So I've got my trusty low pro Whistler bag, it's incredible, great, waterproof, sturdy, got a good frame in it. Yeah, always. Got to keep your camera gear secure. I guess just even moving around within the waterfalls themselves, quite often it'll just be a matter of you've just got to pack your gear into your bag to be able to move safely over slippery rocks, over muddy rocks, over moss, all of these sort of things. So yeah, carrying a bag, definitely. On an overnight multi-day hike, it's not just your camera gear, then it's your food and everything as well. But typically, I guess my standard camera bag is going to weigh close to 12 kilos by the time I've got my filters, 2 cameras, 2 lenses, maybe 3, plus my tripod. That'd be like a standard day. It'd be about 12 kilos. So it's still pretty heavy. But I also like to make sure that I can get the shots as well. Don't want to be walking into these places and be limited to what I can capture.
Cool. And Jason, another question that's on YouTube in terms of stitching photos together when using a CPL.
Yeah, I don't really stitch waterfall photos together. I guess 16mm for me is going to be wide enough to shoot most of the scenes that I'm shooting. I can't, unless I'm shooting to get a super high megapixel image for post-processing or printing on a banner or whatever. I don't really find many instances with waterfalls where I would shoot stitched images. So yeah, there are things to probably consider that when you're moving and rotating your camera around, of the angle of the light for the polarization, all those things. But it's not something that I really worry about, I guess, with waterfalls. I can get my stuff with one shot with a 16mm lens. Yeah,
I guess I might just add on that too, Jason, if that's okay. I think using a CPL in these kind of scenes, it's sometimes very difficult to see where the CPL is having an effect because the scenes are quite full of detail and it's all the same color. So I found if I'm stitching a waterfall, rotating the CPL and stitching those images seems to work okay. Whereas if I'm shooting a blue sky, it's a totally different story.
Yeah, definitely. No, for sure. If you're shooting a blue sky, you end up with patchiness and completely different hues and tones of the blues. But yeah, with waterfalls, I'm certain there would be things to consider for sure with changes of vibrancy and saturation throughout the image and obviously the change of the angles and reflections on certain parts of the water or whatever, but I just don't shoot to stitch for waterfalls.
Cool.
All right. Okay. Now I want to show you, I guess, a few of my personal favorite images, and these are images, I guess, that have got a story behind them, or at least the locations themselves have got a story behind them and a sense of adventure. And I guess that's one of the things that I'm really looking for. Like waterfall images are an awesome result of a fun adventure. And that's how I've always kind of thought of my photography is if you're out there having fun, that's 70% of everything. The other 30% is, you know, the images that come with that. But creating the memories, I guess, is something that's pretty important. And so I'll start with these two images. And so Lower Chasm Falls in Tasmania. Now, I don't want to have too much of a claim with this, but I'm very certain that before this particular image was published on social media, that this location was quite unknown. Myself and another mate in Tassie decided to make a crazy trip. We'd heard about this place, kind of read it in a waterfall guide. I know that a well-known photographer in Tassie had kind of been there, but he never shared his images before from here. Anyway, we went in this day, and we were just completely blown away by this. It was kind of like a fairy tale land, like walking into it. The moss, for us, there was no foot traffic through at this particular point in time in terms of when this image was shot. So the moss was just everywhere, bright, vibrant. There was like all of the leaves, the foliage, everything around this waterfall. It was just like it not many people had kind of made the time to venture into it. It's now quite a lot easier to get into. And I guess this image got widely shared across social media. And it also led to me later on kind of regretting sharing it after multiple trips in there and kind of seeing a lot of the moss around in these rocks where people had started to climb on them and getting selfies up above here, and then all of the rubbish and the trash that was left on the tracks getting in there, and you could see the foot part, like the slippery banks that had just been worn away after the foot traffic had gone in there. So it's kind of a bit of a mixed emotions when I see it, in terms of remembering the trip and the first time that I saw it, but also remembering the result of what social media and I guess exposure for really incredibly beautiful locations can do as well. So that's Lower Chasm Falls. Now the waterfall on the right is Beauchamp Falls in Northern Territory. Now I'd gone up to the Northern Territory to spend a month up there, and specifically had timed pretty much the entire trip around a small plane flight over Beauchamp Falls. Now, at the time that I was up there, it was absolute peak wet season. So all of the major tracks to all of the major really well-known waterfalls in Northern Territory throughout Kakadu were all shut. You couldn't get anywhere. So the only way to get in there was to go by plane. Now, I had specifically gone into Kakadu and timed the trip up there. And the day I got there, got a call from the pilot who basically said, "Hey, look, I'm really sorry, but the plane has to go in to have its engine replaced." Now, with commercial flights, small planes have to have their engine replaced after every so many flight hours. So the plane had to go in, and he kind of said to me, 1 or 2 days will be right, and do a test flight and make sure everything's okay, and then we'll be good. I'm like, okay, cool. Now we can last 1 or 2 days. And I kind of spent the next couple of days just exploring all the yellow water billabong, all those sort of places in Kakadu. And then I called up on the second day, and he's like, "Oh no, the plane's still down." I'm like, this is tough, because this is the one thing that I really wanted to do up here. Anyway, 4 days it took. It took 4 days before we could get on the plane. Anyway, he called me and he said to me, "We can still take you up if you really want to." And I'm like, "Of course I want to." And it's like, I just need to let you know, though, that you're the first flight since the engine's been replaced." And I'm like, "Okay, but you've tested it, right?" He's like, no, you will be the first flight. As in, like, the engine was replaced. It was wheeled out of the airplane mechanics shed onto the airport runway, and I was literally the first flight of doing that. And so my memories of that, of just being so desperate to get to this waterfall, of sitting around waiting for 4 days to having a plane that just had its engine replaced and hadn't even been tested yet, and going straight up to it, just a kind of a really cool memory. And to be able to get the rainbow at the base of the waterfall was pretty special. It was just to see the amount of water flowing through this part of Australia during wet season. It's just crazy. And you can understand why the roads are shut once you see it from the air, that it is a 200-meter waterfall. During dry season, you can swim at the bottom of this waterfall. you certainly wouldn't be able to swim here now. So yeah, it's definitely two of my most memorable waterfalls. Now, the next image is the same waterfall as the first one. After this first trip of going into Lower Chasm Falls, I went in multiple times again afterwards. And this particular trip I was about to do the Overland Track. Actually 2 days after this, we went in and did the Overland Track. I had a good mate from Melbourne come over. Another good mate came as well, so two guys, but it was just two of us. And we arrived here, and he was so desperate to see this waterfall. And I promised I will get you in there. I promise you I'll take you in. And we arrived too late one afternoon to go in. It just started to get too dark. We decided to extend the Overland Track trip by an extra 2 days before it to just do some exploring around Northwest Tassie. And yet we ended up deciding he was so desperate. We camped in the car and kind of slept in his car the night before. And it's the closest I've ever been to a guy in a a photography mission, to literally be sleeping together in the car. We just like, okay, we have to get in there first light of the morning. It'd be the perfect if we can get in there with fog, everything coming down. The snow had already been melting. It had been a pretty awesome snow season already up in the Highlands in Tassie. And it was just crazy flow and this awesome fog. It was just a really cool trip just to kind of remember, just being able to take somebody in there who'd really wanted to see it for so long, and to just get those perfect conditions for the fog and everything else through the forest. So without a doubt, my favorite location is still to shoot anywhere. It's not just my favorite waterfall, it's my favorite location. It just feels like a fantasy land. It feels like you could have fairies and pixies flying around in here. Okay, next to now
yes,
this.
Just back on that last image, there was just a question about the settings used on it.
Yep. So,
and you're also able just to full screen it as well.
Yep. Sorry. So settings on this, that is a 15-second exposure. So I've actually shot that with a 3-stop ND and a polarizer. I did get a mixture of shots where I did get shots with texture detail in the water. But again, it was just crazy conditions in there of the amount of water coming down. So I was kind of limited by how long I could stand in the water and kind of cop the ice cold water that was coming down. But a 15-second exposure, probably anywhere from f8 to f11, which is typically where I shoot most of my waterfalls. I tend to find the aperture of f8 kind of the sharpest point in a lens, whereas f11 is going to help create the depth in the background as well, to kind of be able to capture the detail still in the trees up in the background. So, but yeah, 15-second exposure, CPL, 3-stop, and a soft graduated ND. All right, now the one on the left-hand side is quite a memorable trip that I took. Went canyoning in Blue Mountains. It's kind of not the toughest canyon to do. There's certainly harder ones to do up there, but I can just remember this particular one of getting, and we had to take all our waterproof gear, like bags, like literally the bags that you would use for kayaking, and throw them on the back of your kayak to go out ocean kayaking. And we're kind of like, yeah, okay, why do we need that? Anyway, we got to the location here, and he was our guide for this particular trip. Just said to us, we've got to throw our camera gear down here. And we're like, what? We've got to throw? And anyway, we kind of added it up later. It's between us with GFX 50Ss and Canon 5DSR and 5DS and the lenses that we had and the Nikon bodies that somebody else had. We threw about $180,000 worth of camera gear in waterproof bags over the edge and let it float away out of sight to be able to get down through these canyons. I can't remember ever voluntarily letting my camera gear out of my sight when I'm out shooting, but it was definitely one of the more memorable trips, and kind of highlighted by a 13-meter jump from up high all the way down into this crazy rock pools as well, just a little bit further down beyond this. But I'd love to get back in there again in the Blue Mountains. It was actually one of my aims of moving back to Sydney, of one of the locations that I really want to spend a lot of time exploring, is getting through in the canyons up in Blue Mountains. They're just stunning. And on the right-hand side, Secret Falls. This is the waterfall that was extremely close to where I lived in Hobart. So I visited this so often. I honestly lost count of how many times I went in here. But this particular occasion, I think it was the 2016 or 2017 floods that went through Tassie. They were really, really bad, basically flooded all of northwest Tasmania. It was the first time that I'd ever seen this much water come down off Mount Wellington down through this waterfall. Typically, this waterfall is a trickle. I think if you do a search for Secret Falls or locations in Tassie and find this waterfall, you won't find this much water. In literally more than 50, way more than 50 visits I've made to this waterfall. I'd never seen it like this, and it was just so memorable, I guess, to remember that just 2 days later, after seeing this and the amount of water that came through where I lived in southern Tassie, to remember that northwest Tasmania got wiped out by floods from this particular rainfall that came. So yeah, there's I guess a few of the more memorable images and favorite images, all for different reasons. I think they all have a sense of adventure, a sense of something with them. But the Jim Falls is a lot different, aerial. A lot different to my normal style of long exposures. But lower Chasm Falls, by far, I would travel back to Tasmania just to visit this waterfall. It is absolutely beautiful. And I guess for those that are willing to put the work in, there is 2 more waterfalls up above it in terms of a stream as well. They are quite difficult to get into, and you want to be careful kind of shooting some of the compositions that I've shot in there. But it's pretty amazing. So. Cool. Any questions about those ones?
There's a few comments about wanting to go to Tasmania just to see those lower Chasm Falls. So, yeah. Just another quick story. I had a workshop group in Cradle Mountain, and we were on our way back to Launceston and decided we maybe had a bit of time to make a detour if we were really, really quick to rush into this waterfall. I took the group in a 12-seater van full of all of our gear, like our suitcases as well as our camera gear and everything, because we're on our way to an airport, and it had been really, really heavy, crazy rain. And with the gear, 10 people in the van, so you're 10 people plus everyone's suitcases plus their camera gear, ended up getting the van bogged on a road going into it, and basically almost ended up sliding over the edge of a road. So again, there's a lot of good memories of going to this waterfall, and to those that are in this webinar tonight, it's still one of the most memorable occasions of any workshop that I've ever been in, getting the van stuck, trying to get everybody to see this particular waterfall. All right. So another question in chat was, did you do Rocky Creek after Sheep Dip?
Yes. Yeah. So we did. Yeah. So Rocky Creek and Sheep Dip. I went in with another couple of good mates. We hired a private guide to take us in. And it's just incredible locations. I'd love to get back in there again in the right conditions, and like Rocky Creek, Sheep Dip, all of it, just the whole, it's just stunning, just beautiful. So yes, some good memories of sliding down these waterfalls and rope trips down, and sending our camera gear down and jumping off stupid heights to get down into them, and seeing tiger snakes inside the canyons and all sorts of interesting things in there. So.
Cool.
All right. So I guess we'll finish up here pretty much, but there's a few things here, I guess, to consider and to take away with you, to be thinking about when you are going out and shooting waterfalls yourself in the future. And these are things that I've seen a lot of times with workshop students. So the first thing really is a tripod that's not stable enough. You really need something that's going to stand up to any movement that water introduces, or any kind of movement from wind, air, anything. The wrong selection of ND filters is quite common as well. So using a 10-stop ND when you shouldn't be. There's no need to use a 10-stop ND under most conditions. This particular waterfall that you can see in the background here, Russell Falls, this is a 3-stop ND that I've used here, again with peak flow. And when I shot this particular one, in between shots, I had to wipe down. And another 3 to 5 second exposure, if you were trying to shoot a 3 to 5 second exposure, there was no way that you could not get water spray on the front, so you had to remove them. So shooting with the wrong ND filters can quite often is a problem that I see. Not using or incorrectly using a CPL. CPL, I will use a CPL with every single waterfall shot that I take. So not using them or incorrectly using them is just something that I find that's very common that people won't do. Incorrectly using them in terms of not getting the CPL set correctly. Not using them just doesn't give you that advantage of introducing the vibrancy and saturation that they can offer. Not changing your shutter speeds when shooting. And what I mean by this is not just using super long exposures. It's about capturing shorter exposures, longer exposures, middle exposures, and trying to I guess, get the best image for the scene. A shorter exposure quite often works where you're actually maintaining that texture on the water as compared to a super long exposure like the one in the background here. So you make sure when you're shooting that you're changing up your shutter speeds. To do that, quite often you need to change your ND filters, but it really is worth it to try and get as many shots as possible from each location that you're visiting. Now, shooting in the wrong conditions, an example of this is this waterfall that I have here. It's a beautiful waterfall, but it's extremely hard to shoot in these conditions because of the amount of wind and of the amount of spray that came down through there. Quite often that you can shoot with too much water in a waterfall. I know it sounds strange, but there can be too much water. Shooting in the time of the day when you've got light penetrating through, when the sun penetrating through to the floor, shooting when the sun's at the wrong angle where it's reflecting off the actual face of the water. Going in there when it's the right conditions is really important. And I guess that comes to a seasonal thing as well. Like I said at the beginning, Northern Territory, Western Australia, North Queensland, they're amazing to shoot from November through to May. Whereas Tasmania is the opposite. You tend to want to shoot down there from July through to September, July through to October, when it's kind of like the end of winter coming through to spring, when you're starting to get slightly less flow. And yeah, water spray on lenses, it's a really something that I've noticed so often, that you don't pick up on it unless you're being told that it's there. When you're standing behind the camera, you quite often won't notice that water spray on your lens. So just really important, just carry some lens cloths. So make sure you've got a stable tripod, shooting with the right exposure speeds, making sure that you're shooting multiple exposure speeds. Try and time your visit for the right conditions for that season or that area, and just make sure you keep your front of your lens clean. Now, a lot of the waterfalls that you've seen as well, I've visited those locations so many times. I can go into a location and shoot and come away with nothing. It sometimes takes 3, 4, 5, 6 visits until you start seeing the location for what it can really be, or start seeing multiple exposures, coming away with the best images, coming in there, knowing where the sun's going to be to produce sunbeams coming through the trees. It can take, a few things. It's all about location knowledge. And because of that, I just enjoy the adventure. Go out there, chase those waterfalls and make sure that you enjoy doing it first and foremost, because the images will come once you're having that fun and having that adventure. So
may I tell everyone a very quick story, please? I live in Armidale, and the road to the coast is called Waterfall Way, and all in the New England area we have so many waterfalls in this area. And in 1866 we have a very famous fall not far from town called Danger's Falls. It's about 183 metres. It's in a Danger's Gorge. And in 1866, a travelling showman came to Armidale and stretched a 185 metre wire rope cable across the gorge, advertised this as a death-defying show. All the people came out in their horses and buggies to watch this man fall to his death. And He crossed the rope several times, once including wheeling a wheelbarrow with no safety net over this huge waterfall and gorge. And it's quite a legend in this area. And it's part of the one of the New England National Park areas.
Well, I definitely don't recommend doing that.
I just thought you might find it a little bit entertaining to know that story.
Cool. Awesome.
Thank you, Margaret.
Cool. All right.
Jason, there's a few questions, if you don't mind.
Go. Let's go for it.
Yeah. So the first one was just from me. I know you're very specific about the time of day you like to shoot waterfalls. Can you just run through when's the best time of day? When do you like to shoot waterfalls?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on how exposed the waterfall is, but it's typically really early in the mornings or late in the afternoon. Just like sunrise or sunset, there's the best time to be there, and it's all about the angle of the sun. For me, I want perfectly even light with the waterfalls that I'm in. So trying to get in early in the morning when the sun is quite low, or late in the afternoon when the sun's quite low, because a sun that's high in the sky is going to create shadows. So anywhere that the sun is basically falling through foliage, you're going to create shadows and I guess brighter spots. So for me, morning, really early morning, late in the afternoon, or in really overcast days. I used to love it when it was a rainy day. I'd just be like, waterfall day, this is perfect. Where are we going? What are we doing? Let's get out and explore, get a group of people together. Let's go and find a new waterfall, because those overcast days are the days when you can shoot all day. It doesn't really matter what time of the day you're in. The sun's not going to penetrate through the clouds so much. So, but yeah, early in the mornings and late in the afternoon really is kind of key.
And another question from Facebook was, any tips for shooting Astro and waterfalls? Particularly how to light up the falls.
Yeah, I've actually, this particular waterfall, Russell Falls, I've got to actually create it one day. I've done it. So I actually shot both a light painted version, but also a version prior to it getting dark. So there was enough light to capture a longer exposure, and then catching the sky second. Like, I guess it's really hard to light paint a really large subject enough to create that exposure that you need to blend with the sky with a waterfall. So I should edit it one day. I have done it before, but it's quite difficult, I guess, with a lot of these scenes, because the foregrounds and the foresty areas are going to be really dark to kind of shoot even during the days sometimes. So getting that exposure correctly on the foreground is going to be really important. So yeah, if you can light paint your foregrounds, it's great. You just got to be careful of what sort of reflections come off brighter areas of the water, I guess, but, even with a light pointed at it.
Cool. And you mentioned at this fall, at Russell Falls a couple of times, that obviously getting stuff on the front of your filter was a problem. Do you recommend a certain type of white to handle that?
Look, any microfiber cloth, but there's also some of the camping towels. I find, like the really lightweight camping towels that you can get from most camping stores. They make really, really, really good lens cloths. They're going to be bigger and they quite often will roll up. But if you're in a super wet conditions, like a nice big cloth that's really absorbent and going to get those swipes off. A microfiber cloth is going to get really wet quite quickly. So if you're kind of standing there and getting a shower yourself, a microfiber cloth's not going to stand up to too much. So yeah, there's some really cool camping towels that are just really lightweight. You can get them out of Kathmandu or those sort of camping stores.
Cool. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself, turn your video on, ask a question. That would be great.
There was a tip someone gave me once, I don't remember who, that said to drape your lens cloth over your filter lens between shots.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. If you can, that is a good tip. I'm pretty sure it was a highly intelligent person who gave it to you as well. But putting your lens cloth over the front. If the trick to that though would be to lock your focus first. You don't want your focus to be tracking when you lift the cloth. So basically, the whole point is just to create a curtain on the front of your lens and just lift it up. Take your shot, drop it back down, clean it off. It works really well. Just a tip with that, just to be in manual focus mode when you're doing it so that you're not auto-focusing at all. And manual settings are great. So if you've already got your settings all ready to go, nothing needs to be done with aperture or shutter priority settings or anything. Manual, get your ISO, get your aperture, get your shutter speed right. And then, you can easily do that. Just kind of reveal the front of your lens when you're shooting. Yeah.
Cool.
Can I ask a question on composition?
Yep.
Are you trying to get the base of the waterfall horizontal, or are you trying to get the water flowing vertically, or you don't really, just whatever looks natural?
I guess it depends on the waterfall. So like compositionally, I'll just try and find one slide here. I guess this particular waterfall here is just about a straight drop, and then composition is about the water flow and the direction of the flow, as compared to, say, the waterfall here on the right with Secret Falls, where we're not worried about the leading lines or anything coming through. So it depends on what you're trying to do with the rest of the image to what you're doing. I try to make sure the waterfalls are standing upright as much as possible. If there's separation between the water and the back wall, I'll try to highlight that if you can, or try to at least capture that. I guess it kind of shows the cleanness of the flow through to this sort of image here, where compositionally quite limited. The flow in the front kind of works here, but you can kind of show the direction revealing of the water. Depends on the scene itself. Like this one here, again, the composition is about everything really in this scene. It's kind of about showing the whole scene in terms of kind of the fairy tale kind of feel to it. But yeah, I mean, it just depends on the image. So this is isolating the water and not worrying about the flow at all. It's really just showing the flow behind the trees being revealed, which is very similar to this one, I guess, as well, where there's no flow as such. It just depends on the scene itself, and the same waterfall can create multiple composition options as well.
Thanks.
All right, guys, if
Any
that's it,
yeah, I think that's it. All right, well,
Cool.
I just wanted to say thank you very much, Jason. That was fantastic. Some amazing images of waterfalls. I definitely love some of those ones from Tasmania. I think very special images, and such a beautiful location.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate you taking time out of your night. Hopefully we're helping you get through lockdown with some of these sessions. We will be back next week. Next week, we've got a bit of a panel discussion happening, so it'll be a little bit different. There'll be plenty of opportunity to ask questions, and keep an eye on our social media to get details for that next week. We should have that announced probably on Monday, and that should be a really good week to join us next week, Saturday at 8 p.m, same time. So thanks very much, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thanks very much,
Thanks,
guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
guys.
Jason.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you very
Cheers.
much.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Andrew.
No worries, man. Cheers. Thanks for joining.
Thank
See you
you.
again.
No problem.
Thanks.
Enjoying the session. It's great.
Excellent.